So I saw in preparing for this interview that a recent poll shows that 2/3 of the public thinks crime is a huge problem in this country, and 8 in 10 say it is a huge problem in particular in large cities. And yet, violent crime rates are at or near historic lows. So there's some kind of disconnect going on, and I'm curious what you think is going on here.
The Copaganda book is really my attempt to struggle through that question. How is it that people's perceptions of safety are so disconnected from reality? And what are the mechanisms that have created that disconnect, and who benefits from it? And in particular, why is that fear so integral to the goals of the authoritarian project? So I think what Copaganda for me has really 3 main components that really get at that question. The first thing that Copaganda does in the news media is it narrows our conception of safety and threat. So it's not just that people are afraid generally. People are afraid of very particular things. They're sort of taught to be afraid of poor people, of immigrants, of black people, of people of color generally, right? Of strangers, right? But they're also taught through the news media to ignore a vast and much wider range of harms that actually are much more linked to their safety. So, there's a lot of talk in the news media about the rise of shoplifting and organized retail theft and property crime, right? But wage theft is $50 billion a year. It's like 5 times all property crime combined. Tax evasion is like $1 trillion a year, right? That's like 60 times all of the property crime combined in this country. Corporate fraud, et cetera, $800 billion. So you get the point. Same with water pollution. There are literally hundreds of thousands of known water pollution crimes every single year in the United States that cause catastrophic harm to people, families, communities, the natural world. Air pollution is another great example.
I mean,
right?
we're here in Denver. Air pollution on the Front Range is something that causes all sorts of health problems, deaths. So yes, air pollution is a great example for where we're sitting right now.
But you don't see nightly news stories about air pollution crimes. And much of the air pollution actually is criminal, right? It's the deliberate spewing of toxic chemicals into the air. It kills 100,000 people in the United States every year. That's 5 times all homicide combined. But you don't see nightly news stories in high volume, right? So one thing that it does first is it's got us scared of some people in some places sometimes and ignoring much wider harms. But the second thing it does, which I think is really central to your question, is having made us kind of only narrowly focus on some threats, it constantly makes us afraid of those threats and tells us that those threats are increasing and increasing and increasing. So it's not just this year's polling data that you mentioned. Over the last 25 years, every single year, if you look at the public polling, people think crime is up. Almost every single one of those years, crime was actually down. Interestingly, if you look inside that data, people are much more likely to have an accurate view of their own neighborhood. They're much more likely to say, well, crime in my neighborhood actually may not be up, but everywhere else it's up. Like you pointed out, like big cities, right? So people are constantly afraid that crime is out of control in these other places that they don't live, right? So when their perceptions of the world are mediated through the mass media, they're actually less informed and actually misinformed. And then I think the most important and third kind of feature of Copaganda, which gets at your question, is having made us afraid of really narrow range of things and made us constantly more and more and more afraid, it tells us that the only solution to our fears is more and more and more investment in the bureaucracies of state control and repression, in the authoritarian project. This is kind of like a modern flat earther movement. It's like climate science denial. It's the overwhelming evidence is that the levels of interpersonal harm in our society. And by the way, I got into this work because I actually think that even though, police reported crime is at historic lows, our society has way too much interpersonal harm, way too much violence, way too much trauma, right? That's why I do this work. That's what brought me into the civil rights field and the public safety field. But what we're being told is that the solution is actually more government repression, which actually leads to more inequality, right? Which actually further contributes to the interpersonal harm, because the things that are most connected to how much we hurt each other in society are like inequality and poverty, access to healthcare, early childhood education, access to housing, levels of loneliness and isolation, and levels of community connection and involvement, and things like pollution, like lead pollution, things like toxic masculinity, right? These sort of cultural, political, and economic forces that if you look across American history and if you look across societies around the world, those are the things that are linked with how much people are hurting each other, not like little tweaks in the policies of police or prosecutors.
I think that's a good segue to a question about people's perception of really what raises their sense that crime is supposedly rampant. I mean, you have talked about what you call the aesthetic of disorder. This idea that if you go out and see in your city a lot of homelessness or a lot of poverty or a lot of whatever you might characterize as disorder, the mind sort of jumps to this must mean there must be associated and attendant crime. Is that basically the theory?
I think certainly that's one of the things that the mass media tries to cultivate in people's mind, a link between what are fundamentally problems of political economy and crime. The idea in much of the mainstream news media is that something like a problem of homelessness should be addressed through armed government bureaucrats with metal chains and cages, right? As opposed to investing in the things that actually could help people have safe and thriving communities and places to live that are ecologically sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. So this book that I wrote, Copaganda, is not focused on the right wing. It's focused on sort of what are more commonly thought of as mainstream or liberal news outlets. One of the main projects of those outlets is to distract people from what I think are really material conditions of people's lives, and to constantly be pushing solutions like more police in the subway and more police, disrupting homeless encampments, et cetera, as if erasing from the immediate public view the fact of a single person being unhoused is going to solve the problem of homelessness.
Well, but I wonder how much you think that comes from. I remember growing up and hearing a lot about this, the broken windows theory. And for those who don't know what that is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically the idea that if you allow for an aesthetic of disorder, this is kind of, I think, a Rudy Giuliani, Bill Bratton theory, that if you allow for the aesthetic of disorder, broken windows, graffiti, et cetera, if you allow for that, that will somehow sort of osmotically engender the idea that crime is permissible. And that on the other side, if you harshly crack down on that, if you clean up the city, make it aesthetically look controlled, clean, et cetera, it will somehow, again, osmotically deter crime. I mean, do you think it comes from that?
No, I think that's one phase of the sort of capitalist class, neoliberal, real estate development-driven response to these sort of historical problems. That was a phase that served a very particular purpose at a very particular time in the history of kind of the post-Reagan neoliberal wave, right, of mass incarceration. So I think it's important to unpack this, right? So broken windows policing is completely discredited empirical theory. It has no basis in actual fact, but it was adopted by police departments across the country, not because anybody actually thought it was going to fix the problems in our society, like safety and poverty and violence, et cetera, but because it was very, very useful for the massive project of gentrification. A term of propaganda that is used in the news media is the quality of life offense, right? Whose life? What does quality mean here, right? I unpack that a little bit in the book. But I think it's really important to understand when you look at any of these policies, you have to ask yourself, who benefits from this policy? And then who benefits from the way that the news media discusses this policy? Then I think it's important to also understand what are the policy trade-offs. So at the same time that the police were deciding to focus on low-level drug possession, trespassing, all the loitering, stuff like that, they're ignoring hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits, right? So the policing bureaucracy in this country, for a variety of reasons we could talk about that have to do with overtime and what they were incentivized through federal grants to cover and certain political and ideological interests and real estate developers at the local level, but for a variety of reasons that also have to do with race and gender, they made a deliberate choice to ignore rampant sexual assault in our society and to focus on low-level drug crime. Now, I want to make a really important set of points about this, what you're talking about, this sort of subjective feeling of fear in a society. One is what I call the volume of news, and another is the selective curation of anecdote. These two things kind of work together. What do I mean by the volume of news? So with a lot of these low-level offenses like shoplifting, did you see a couple years ago there was like a viral clip of a shoplifting from a Walgreens, like a guy on a bicycle?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's hard to exist in American culture without having seen that video.
Yeah.
Tens of millions of views, right? It was actually kind of an impressive shoplifting. It was like one of those old game shows where you have to swipe as many things into your cart and you win if you get the largest amount of money in your cart,
Right.
So he was swiping things into these bags on his bicycle, and he somehow wheeled out of the open door, that single incident of shoplifting spawned in the 4 weeks afterward 309 separate news stories on that one shoplifting from Walgreens. At the same time, not a single news story about the much larger wage theft by Walgreens that was alleged by its own employees, okay? But it contributed to this incredible moral panic in our society for multiple years that shoplifting was out of control. At a time when shoplifting was down and property crime was at historic lows, people were feeling like retail theft and shoplifting was rising. We now know from the industry's own admissions and some great investigative reporting that actually shoplifting was not up. There's no evidence of that. In fact, there's lots of evidence that it was manufactured for a variety of political reasons. But people feel that way, so much so that many governors in progressive states, Illinois, California, New York, started devoting hundreds of millions of more dollars to policing, prosecution, and punishment of shoplifting, even though it was at record lows, right? Many really important issues in our society are not thought of as daily and nightly news stories, but they're thought of as kind of like a big investigative story that happens like once, right? So when I was litigating all these unconstitutional bail systems around the country, hundreds of thousands of people illegally jailed, separated from their families. Actually, much of that is a federal crime. I would go to these news editors like the New York Times, and I'd say, just filed a big new challenge to the bail system in this city. And they'd say, oh, well, actually, somebody already wrote about the bail system in that other city. And it's a great story, but like somebody already did that. Or we did that in your other case in Houston, So we're not going to cover this bail system in New Orleans or St. Louis or whatever. Imagine if you go to a local news reporter and you say, hey, I want you to cover this carjacking in Cleveland last night. And the news reporter would say, well, actually, somebody wrote a story about a carjacking in Phoenix last week, so we can't cover that. That's not how they think about the crimes of the poor, but it is how they think of certain big stories. So like the epidemic of plastic pollution, trillions of pieces of plastic littered into the streams and earth in this country every single year, destroying natural ecosystems, having really important effects on our bodies. We each have a spoonful of plastic in our brains right now as we're talking, right? That's seen as like one story a year. That's like an investigative piece. But if it were a story on the nightly news every night, it would create more of a subjective feeling of urgency. What I'm getting at here is you can take a single city, and it can be a year when homicides or shoplifting are down in that city. But if you have twice as many news stories on it, or 5 times as many news stories on it, people could feel like it's up. The volume of crime stories is actually not connected at all to levels of crime, but it's much more tied to certain political events, like elections or the consideration of certain reform packages or things like that, right? So that's the volume of news. The second thing that's really important is a selective curation of anecdote. What do I mean by that? So imagine you ask me, we're here in Denver. So, right. So like, you asked me to explain to someone who's never seen Nikola Jokic play basketball. Is this guy a good passer? I can make a montage of Jokic's entire career, but I can only include all of his missed passes. Just miss after miss after miss after miss after miss.
I see where you're going.
I make like an 8-hour montage of Jokic just missing passes. I could convince you that Jokic is not a good passer instead of maybe the best passing big man in NBA history.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Could do the same with Michael Jordan. I can make a video of all of Michael Jordan's misses and I can convince you that the greatest basketball player of all time is a terrible shooter. Okay. This is what the news media does with crime. It's the curation of true anecdotes, because the best propaganda is always based on true facts, or facts that are where the target propaganda audience is unable to determine if they're true or not, right? The best propaganda, especially propaganda against liberals, is based on true facts, but it's using selectively curated true facts to create a false impression. This is what the news media does with shoplifting, with carjacking, with murder, with crime generally, right? It has us thinking that crime is up and feeling very deeply that crime is up, when in fact, the truth is that crime is down.
So I wonder how much you think this is ideology versus a kind of crass decision-making in newsrooms on the old, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Like, let's go back to the example of air pollution. Air pollution is a crime, a kind of mass crime, where essentially invisible microscopic particles are going into people's lungs and essentially killing them every day. That is less telegenic or less sort of shocking visually on a TV show than surveillance footage of a carjacking. So I think I wonder how much you think there's ideology under what you're discussing versus a sort of kind of need for attention in an ever noisier media landscape.
The top line answer to that is I do not think that's what's going on in mainstream crime reporting, public safety reporting. But I have a few sort of things I want to say about it. And by the way, like what I try to do in the book is really unpack this because I think it's so important to understand what's going on here. I've spent a lot of time working on the book, reading the literature, interviewing hundreds of journalists, actually working really closely with local TV news producers, right? You can make really popular local TV segments about public safety that have a really different political, ideological, and subject matter content, right? So for example, instead of stationing a reporter at the police station, you can station a reporter in landlord-tenant court. And every day you can have a story on the news, or every week, bad landlord of the day. And you just tell people the really wild stuff landlords do to people. It turns out people love those segments, okay? And in those segments, they're reporting a different kind of crime or different kind of wrongdoing by a different kind of actor in a way that actually is quite popular.
This used to be a big thing on local news.
Huge thing.
Like a consumer protection fight for you. There was a radio host in town who did that. So you're right. In you just saying that, I realized that that's essentially gone.
It doesn't happen very much anymore. The same is true of the inspector that tests the soil in your local playground. It turns out a lot of parents and grandparents and relatives, they want to know which neighborhood playgrounds have toxic soil. You put a story like that on the news, people will watch it, people will share it. It's very popular.
100%.
Okay. So what is happening here? Well, I think there's a lot of factors, but I think one big one is there's been a hollowing out of the infrastructure for local news production. A lot of local news outlets are very short-staffed. The resources for doing a lot of actual reporting, as you know quite well, are dwindling in our society for reasons that are very intentional. But I want to say something about that. The police and the sort of policing bureaucracy, what I call in my first book, Usual Cruelty, the punishment bureaucracy, which is my term for what a lot of people call the criminal justice system, which is like a term of propaganda, which is designed to convey that what this massive bureaucracy does is something called justice, or what it's trying to do is justice. So the punishment bureaucracy is responsible for a lot of these stories that you're seeing. I had no idea before I started researching for the book. There is a multi-billion-dollar PR industry underneath every single story that you see on public safety.
Yeah, I mean, this is crazy, and you write a lot about this in your book, and it was really eye-opening about how that's embedded in these police departments, in these government agencies, funded by us, so that we are essentially, I mean, I'm using the sort of royal we the taxpayers, are paying for a propaganda machine to propagandize back to us. For somebody who doesn't even know that exists, just give them the size, scope, how it works.
We don't know the size of it. We don't know the scope of it in most cities because it's taken actual investigative journalism and a bunch of city council members in some cities just demanding to finally know how their own money is being spent, right? So But in Los Angeles alone, a few years ago, there was an investigative look at this. The LA sheriff alone, 42 full-time PR officers. Okay, the LAPD had another 25. That's just the top 2 police departments in LA. We're not even getting into the other dozens of police departments, all the feds, the DA's office, the mayor's office, right? Then the private companies that are in, the police foundation, the police union. Chicago, when the Chicago cops killed Laquan McDonald, unarmed black teenager, there were 4 full-time PR officers in Chicago when Rahm Emanuel tried to hide that police killing. Today, as we sit here, there's over 50 in Chicago. Okay, about 90 of the NYPD. And these people are very sophisticated. As a bunch of local TV news producers explained to me, they don't just like send us the police reports of who's been arrested the night before. They literally produce stories for us. They give us audio, video, charts, graphs, people to interview, experts that we can call on. They connect us with pro-police professors who can offer an opinion about what the police did. So they literally produce the news. That's another thing that's going on. But I also want to say this is a really important thing to be nuanced about because it's not just 1 or 2 things. And we're talking about a whole ecosystem of propaganda in the media industry. And there are different people along the way that have different incentives and different ideological perspectives. So the people who own much of the media, right, have their own interests, right? And that's a big one, right? So media that is owned by some of the richest people in our society is generally going to produce content overall, with some exceptions, that they're going to affect who's hired, they're going to affect what stories are told. It's not important to allege this kind of vast conspiracy where everyone is exactly on the same page and everyone knows exactly what the propaganda is. What we're actually talking about is a complex ecosystem where everyone is sort of pursuing kind of their own incentives and interests. And the overall result is a system that produces news that supports, in general, who has power and money in our society, and supports, in general, the capacity of those people to control repressive government apparatuses in ways that keep benefiting them, but that manifest a little bit differently in different ways.
Okay, so I want to offer some devil's advocate questions here. So let's flip this around. Having worked in politics, I think a lot of pro-police messaging in politics comes from politicians' core belief that voters will never be able to hear them on anything else if they first and foremost do not feel safe and do not feel their political leaders are first and foremost prioritizing their safety. So I think the run-of-the-mill rank-and-file politician who perhaps hasn't thought a ton about this is like, well, look, I want to do X, Y, and Z for my city or for my state, but I realize that if I get trapped in this weak on crime situation and people who are already being taught to feel afraid of everything see me as not making them safe, they'll never be able to hear other things that I want to do. Do you think that's the dynamic? And if you do think that's the dynamic for the sort of run-of-the-mill politician, how do you break that?
I think what you've offered is a very convenient, good faith excuse for those people to adopt certain positions that are actually positions that benefit the people who tend to dominate political donation. So I get it. And I think I want to say there's a lot to say about it, but I want to say a couple of things here. First, the view that more investment in punishment is a way to make society safer is like, as I said, like a flat earth kind of position. It's completely false. We know that from looking at the experience of all of the other countries that are of comparable wealth to the United States. We know that from looking at the U.S.'s own history. We know that from all the comparative research that's being done. So what people are essentially saying here is we want to contribute to a big lie that we know is false. We want to deny global warming, for example, for the benefit of winning an election. So first of all, you have to think to yourself, is it worth winning an election with certain types of lies? Because what kind of electorate am I creating? I think it's very Orwellian. what you're asking for is to say 2 + 2 = 5. To constantly be telling people 2 + 2 = 5. You'll be safer with more repression. You'll be safer with more surveillance. You'll be safer if we build the infrastructure of our own repression, right? That's what you're telling people. And by the way, if you're a progressive, you have to understand every major achievement that you've achieved in American history has been the result of multiracial, working class social movements that clawed whatever benefits they got from the power structure at every turn, whether it's women's suffrage or slavery or the rights of indigenous people or LGBTQ movements or economic justice or anti-war movements. Every concession was fought for. And who fought against that at every turn? The policing, prosecutorial, and punishment bureaucracies. For 150 years, the punishment bureaucracy has tried to crush through whether it's Hoover and COINTELPRO or the Red Squads. A lot of people don't realize that at the height of the civil rights movement, the Chicago Police Department had 500 undercover intelligence officers trying to crush the civil rights movement, just in Chicago, right? So what you're doing when you're saying you're going to win the election by increasing the repressive bureaucracy is you're actually saying, I'm going to help build the infrastructure that is going to be used to prevent me from achieving all of the things that I want to achieve as a progressive, okay? So secondly, though, is a more narrative point. If you're constantly telling people 2 + 2 = 4, and you're constantly sacrificing
2 + 2 = 5.
Sorry, 2 + 2 = 5. And you're constantly sacrificing your own integrity and the truth. Pretty soon, there's nothing concrete to hold on to. There's no leg to stand on. For me, the number one rule of strategic progressive politics is always tell the truth. This is actually the opposite of what every PR person, like if you look at the White House press conferences under Obama or Biden, it's the opposite of what it's all spin all the time. Nothing is the truth. Nothing. They don't treat people as serious adults. They lie to them about everything. It's all, and I have a whole chapter in the book called The Big Deception, which is really about the nature of and how fundamental these lies are. What I've seen in my lifetime, both in the legal system and in politics, people respond to the truth, and they respond to people that they think are telling the truth. This is actually a misconception I think many progressives have about Trump's popularity in certain. I think it's not that people think Trump is telling the truth. There's some really weird stuff going on there, but actually, one thing that Trump does is he seems like he talks the same way in public and in private, and so there's a certain authenticity there that he projects.
Right. He can pathologically lie about specific things, but he is an authentic person who is a pathological liar.
It's very interesting and weird, but I think there's something there. Fundamentally, for me, the best political strategy for progressives, and by the way, progressives have to adopt slightly different strategies than the far right. If you're having an argument with someone, you're willing to punch them in the face and lie to them, you have a range of tools. But if you win arguments by doing that, you can't create the kind of society that we want. So we're more constrained in what we can do. And I think the best strategy for progressives is to relentlessly tell the truth and become known as somebody who has integrity and fights for what they believe in and relentlessly tells the truth. And I think that is the source of the popularity of Bernie Sanders, Zoran Mamdani. I think what you're seeing there, the reason that those people are fundamentally more popular than all of the centrist corporate Democrats, right, is that they have a reputation, a vibe, a brand, there is a sense that they have devoted their political careers to telling the truth. Like Zoran became really prominent a few years ago when nobody really knew who he was, and he just went downtown and did a hunger strike with cab drivers. The reason why I think civil rights work is so important, even in dictatorships, even in authoritarian times, is somebody needs to be saying 2 + 2 = 4. It's not okay to separate these families. It's not okay to be human caging people just because they can't pay $300 in cash bail, right? Even if it's unpopular, even if everybody else is saying it's totally okay to do these things, right? You need to say 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4. This is what I think Orwell captures so beautifully. The moment, even to yourself in a dark room, you say 2 + 2 = 5, all is lost. Because the moment you can't accept and hold on to a basic truth, and that's what I think progressive politics needs to do. Hold on to some core truths. And and I think where the strategy comes in is you pick which truths are going to resonate with the population at any given time. So right now, for example, Luigi Mangione and the sort of complete corruption of the healthcare system, I believe, fundamentally resonates with the population, right? People maybe a lot of people didn't support what he did, but they understood it. And many people actually did support it. You know, I've been seeing Luigi graffiti in all the schools that I go to and some retirement homes. I mean, it's really remarkable. There are certain things that Zoran's campaign capitalized on: expensive rent, affordability, access to early childhood education. Luigi's campaign and some of the beautiful work that a lot of disability advocates are doing right now around healthcare and the corruption of our for-profit health. I think there are truths that are deeply resonant in society. And so I think the task of Democratic Party's strategic communications shouldn't be like, which lies should we tell? It should be, which truths in this current zeitgeist could be the base of a broad base of support. So stop focusing on having the conversation that Trump's wanting you to have on crime, and start talking about these like issues that resonate in a different way that's more truthful. It's sort of my advice to people.
It's a good segue to Trump. At the top of this show, we played a clip of the 1988 Willie Horton ad. And I have a vague memory of it because it was like scary, right? Right? I mean, it was. That ad tells a really scary story. Whether the story is true, not true, whether it left out some details, it was just like really scary. Like, here are two guys. One guy wants to lock up scary people. The other guy let the scary guy out who did something totally scary, and vote for the guy who was smart enough to never do that. My theory on Trump is that Trump is fundamentally, he is a pathological liar. And so I do feel like him focusing his own brand on portraying himself as tough on crime, there's like a direct line from the Willie Horton ad to what Donald Trump wants to be seen as. And he's citing crime as this rationale to deploy troops to Washington, D.C., to Chicago. But you said your point about truth rings through when I see this poll this week that showed just 38% of Americans support that move. Do you think that suggests that we are moving towards a more nuanced understanding of, if not crime, then at least the political showmanship and fraudulence around crime?
First, just as a note for people listening to this, you brought up Willie Horton. It's a great example of the selective curation of anecdote. That was actually a very successful public safety program, the furlough program that Willie Horton got out on. That's a perfect example of the selective curation of that anecdote destroying really, really important programs across the country that actually were hugely effective for increasing public safety. The conventional wisdom in Democratic Party and sort of liberal nonprofit establishment discourse that defund the police was a failure and people don't support any of that stuff, all of that is total and complete nonsense. It's really important to understand this because when I talk to politicians all the time, they are operating in a fantasy world. Their understanding of public opinion in politics is based on misconceptions driven by the consultant class. One thing you have to understand about polling, right, is that the outcomes of a poll are heavily dependent on both what is asked, how it's worded,
and
right?
Who's picking up the phone.
Who's picking up the phone, and also what context is provided to the person right before you ask them the question. So that's why the Republicans have their own pollers and Democrats have their own pollsters, and you can basically get, within reason, a polling result that says kind of anything you want it to say, okay? Now, one thing you have to understand as well is that who does polling in our society? People with a lot of money, okay? So most of these polls are commissioned and structured in a way that really distorts how they operate. Let's just take defund the police, because I think we can both stipulate the sort of political establishment in this country has, I think, the consensus view that slogan is a failure, okay? And it's true, in some of the polls about defund the police, if you ask people if they support defund the police, the vast majority of people say they don't support it. Even Democrats, independents, Republicans, etc. What's not reported in the news media is that in those same polls, when you ask people more specific questions, like, for example, do you support taking some money from the police budget and putting it into healthcare, education, and housing. You know what happens? Overwhelming supermajority support among Democrats, independents, and Republicans.
Right. So you're not really polling the policy, you're polling the language.
Exactly.
Right. You're polling the word defund, which is not really revelatory that a blunt word like that may be misconstrued or construed in negative ways. Whereas if you actually spell out a resource allocation question, people are much more, not just smarter, they've got much more sort of a much more nuanced view.
There was a classic study over a decade ago by this business school professor at Harvard, which kind of like asked people, how unequal do you think our society is? People were way off. They thought our society was way more equal than it is.
Oh, yeah.
They were way off. But then it asked them, how equal do you want our society to be? And they actually, in huge supermajorities across the political spectrum, they wanted our society to be even more equal than they thought it was, which was itself way more equal than it actually is. So I think when you ask me about sort of the zeitgeist and the public opinion and turning against Trump, I actually think fundamentally there's a lot of agreement in our society about certain basics. People want healthy and flourishing communities, and they want really good access to schools, and they want products that don't kill them. They want after-school programs for their kids. Like, there's so many things that they want, right? And a certain level of generality, the job of mainstream corporate media is to either convince those people that that's not possible and that there's all these other things or to make people so afraid that they support policies that actually undermine all those goals. There's a massive distraction from how easy it actually would be to create such a better world.
I think there are a lot of Democrats, and I'm talking about like Democratic leaders, elected officials, who remain terrified of this whole discourse and are doing what Democrats typically do, which are trying, in some cases, in some ways, rhetorical ways, sort of trying to out-Trump Trump. I noticed that Democrats are countering Trump's D.C. buildup by reminding everyone that crime rates are higher in Republican states. The Democrats are citing this recent New York Times headline: "Crime festers in Republican states while their troops patrol Washington." What do you make of this strategy of Democrats trying to depict themselves as actually tougher on crime than Trump, and essentially accepting and actually amplifying the idea that crime is out of control? They're essentially arguing that crime is actually specifically out of control in red states. What do you make of that? Beyond just the political strategy of it, like, what's your reaction to that?
Let me be as clear as I can be. These people are walking us off a cliff. That is the worst political strategy you could possibly imagine to counter.
Is it the worst electoral political strategy or the worst sort of moral policy?
It's
question?
A grotesque moral failure because of the horrific nature of what happens in our jails and prisons, and the ways in which increasing the forces of government repression will destroy the most vulnerable people in our society. But it's also a strategic political failure for some of the reasons I got at earlier. But I want to say something a little bit more pointed about it. Whether it's Gavin Newsom taking smiling photos of him destroying homeless encampments and throwing away all the earthly possessions of unhoused people rather than actually getting safe places for people to live, or Muriel Bowser going on TV and saying she welcomes the federal soldiers in D.C. to help with crime, or Democrats, as you said, spiking the football, saying that crime is worse in Republican areas, right? If you win by adopting all of the attitudes, assumptions, and beliefs of your opponent, the society that you're going to be creating once you take office is going to be no different than the one that your opponent.
I mean, that presumes that they care. I mean, I hate to be that cynical, but that presumes that somebody like Gavin Newsom or Mayor Bowser of Washington, D.C., that presumes that they care long-term what they're governing. It presumes that they don't first and foremost care about their own political ascendance.
So it's a bad political strategy because if people buy the underlying message that you're giving, they're going to vote for the real thing over the fake approximation. But I want to focus on, even if they won using that strategy, the commitments they've made and the type of person they've helped to create through their propaganda is gonna create a society that is just trapped in this cycle of inequality and violence and harm. And it's not the path for progressives. But I think we often get kind of sidetracked by focusing on what's in these people's hearts. And
Sure.
it's like, I happen to believe that people like Muriel Bowser and Gavin Newsom are extremely ambitious people. People always ask me when I was a public defender, how could you defend those people? And what was it like meeting people, charged with crimes? And I would always say I met way more sociopaths when I was on the Harvard Law Review.
Right. I was going to say, like, I presume that the average politician is some form of narcissistic sociopath who cares only about their own self-interest and ambition in the short term.
I think I subjectively believe that too. But whatever your theory is about the psychology of the kind of person that it takes to like seek and gain office in our current unequal society, it's best to treat them that way. It's best to treat them as actors who will only be moved by organized power.
Right.
And so all of our work should be, how do we build working class power in the most vulnerable communities in our society among people of goodwill to achieve the material things that we want for our communities: healthcare, housing, education, a society where all people can flourish, right? A reduction in the size and power of the punishment bureaucracy, family separation, all these things that we can achieve, that we want to achieve. We need to be organizing, because these people are not going to give them to us out of the goodness of their heart. That's not why Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act.
Right. I mean, what you want is them to look out on the world, realize, whether they like it or not, here is the only political formula that will work for me to achieve what I want to achieve. So you've got to create the conditions so that their formula has to navigate to what you want. And so I look at the Democrats saying they look out at the world, Gavin Newsom looks out at the world, for instance, when it comes to crime, and says, the world that I have to navigate right now is a world that I have to navigate this presumption of the current paradigm of the crime conversation. And so I'm trying to navigate inside of that paradigm, because the paradigm hasn't changed yet. What I want to understand, because you mentioned the furlough situation with the Willie Horton ad and how that had been successful. Then you have this ad, and now it's like, everyone ran away from those kinds of programs. I think after we hear just a couple of ideas that you have, the political question is, how do you fortify those ideas against the inevitable demagoguery that will be used against them if and when something with them does not work out perfectly?
A first category is like, there's just a bunch of stuff that we started doing in the mass incarceration era in the society that we should just stop doing immediately. So massive levels of probation and parole. We should just, it's the largest driver of incarceration. It's associated with horrible outcomes and huge expenditures. So just like, people just shouldn't be under government supervision. Pretrial release, bail, right? This is one of the most well-studied areas. We've got really huge studies with millions of cases, and it turns out when you release more people prior to trial, and you don't charge their families money to a for-profit insurance company, the outcomes are way better. Fewer crimes, more families kept together. Employers love it because people get to keep their jobs and healthcare, et cetera. So bail reform is incredibly successful policy. It's one of the most well-studied and successful policies that we have in the criminal system. Removing from the policing bureaucracy things like traffic and mental health calls, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much that even the policing bureaucracy itself, in certain more candid moments, has done internal studies and reports saying we don't need to be doing this stuff, and we're actually not very good at it. Because you have to understand, the police right now in this country only spend 4% of all their time on what they call violent crime. So much of what they do, actually, if people understood it, they would remove it from the police. That's a no-brainer policy that would have huge benefits throughout society. Another really important one is like early childhood education and expansion of Medicaid. These are empirically speaking some of the most important tough on crime policies you can have. Dramatic reductions, lead abatement, Chicago has a lead abatement program that, because of so much fear mongering and crime and so much investment in Chicago police, Chicago's lead abatement program isn't scheduled to fix the problem for 1,000 years. But actually, lead exposure in kids is highly correlated with future involvement in violent incidents and crime, et cetera. So those are some examples. There's so many more.
Those things that the police should stop doing. At some point, you wave your magic wand, the police stop doing those things. No probation, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody who would have been on probation now is not on probation, does something horrible that becomes a viral 10 million YouTube view clip. The inevitable presidential campaign ad comes down that the governor or the mayor who did that is Michael Dukakis in 1988. What's the solution, the political or the sort of social psychological solution to when that happens, we don't regress?
This is really, in a nutshell, kind of why I wrote this book and why all the royalties are donated to charity and why we have free copies available for students and teachers and people. We're just trying to get this question and a real discussion about it. How do we build the infrastructure within what I would call the sort of left, within the center left and the left, to be more resilient to that kind of propaganda? One thing is just is transforming and organizing the media ecosystem so that the information dissemination apparatuses that we have on the left are not adopting the right-wing view and are not furthering what is essentially climate science denial and flat eartherness, and is actually helping people think more critically and more based on evidence. So there's a whole set of interventions in terms of the ownership and power of sort of frontline journalists and investment in reporting and in critical consumption of the news and building civil society groups where people are doing learning and reading and growing together. Another is we have totally, as a left, we have kind of abandoned certain mechanisms of cooperation and solidarity that would be really, really important. So, for example, we have failed to engage nurses unions and the public health world and teachers unions and home health care workers and public defenders. We have failed to draw all the links between what kinds of investments we would actually need to make in all these other areas to have a much safer society. And actually, it turns out there are a lot of constituencies that would dramatically benefit from different types of social investments. So one way to inoculate ourselves against that backlash is to get buy-in from many other corners of society who have something at stake in better public safety policy. And if you have that buy-in from faith communities, from the sort of academic world, from like all the wide constellation of unions who are actually being decimated by the sort of mass incarceration world, I think that there's something to be said for building a broader political coalition around a certain set of key principles, reducing mass incarceration being one of them, that will actually help inoculate. Because I think one of the things that the right wing has done really well is, and what centrist Democrats have unfortunately exacerbated as part of their own political strategy for survival in a fight against the left, is they've tried to pick off certain pieces of what could be a broad anti-fascist coalition by convincing them to be really afraid of these policies that would create much more equality and flourishing in our society. And this is what I think is so dangerous about sort of the Ezra Klein and the abundance movement right now. They're actually doubling down on this really divisive kind of splitting of the anti-fascist coalition around this kind of neoliberal idea, which I think is really, really dangerous, because if that happens, then any reduction that we do in mass incarceration, that kind of neoliberal center, which has huge outside influence over the information dissemination propaganda architecture in our society, will attack it. And so I think a big part of our project should be building a stronger anti-fascist coalition in general that can be more resilient to the kind of grifters and self-promoting ambitious people that really benefit from dividing the left in that way.
Alec Karakatsanis, his book is Copaganda. I encourage everyone listening to this to read it. We'll make sure it is linked in our show notes. Thanks for taking time today.
Thanks for having me.